We will now start our debate on integrated border management, the way forward. And I would like to invite our panelists to join me here on stage. Professor Mark Coles from the Brussels Free University. He's Professor of Criminology. Very warm welcome. I think Anna Mrozek from the Faculty of Law, University of Leipzig, will be with us shortly, but she's warmly welcome as well. Dr. Patrick Pawlak, Senior Analyst at the European Union Institute of Security Studies in Paris. And last but not least, Ilkka Laitinen, the Executive Director of Frontex. What I would like to do in this panel discussion, and as I said, you will have a chance to ask questions, make comments, interact with us very, very shortly, is to go through two sets of issues with us. First of all, to what extent the border management strategy has stood the test of time. You all remember its 5 pillars, the assumptions which were built into it. To what extent this border management strategy has worked, what needs to change. And the second set of issues relates very closely to what Ruben Tayotti has just mentioned, how the Schengen idea is perceived. What do the citizens really think about internal security and the role of border management in that context? We all know that in the context of European Parliament elections, which have just started in 2 member states at least, the Netherlands and the UK, this has been a very vital issue to address. So let me zoom out first to the outside world and ask Dr. Pawlak to tell us about the international context in which we are operating. Warm welcome to Dr. Mrozek as well. The international context in which we are operating, what are the key challenges which then translate themselves for challenges to border management system, and how the common security and defense policy and border management are becoming more integrally linked with each other.
Okay, well, thank you, Pavel, and thank you to Frontex for a very kind invitation. I'm really very honored to be here on the panel with such wonderful speakers, but especially with Ilkka, given that it's his last conference, so I'm very happy to be part of that. To reshape your question a bit, I think that one of the important questions to ask, especially in the context that we're in, is really what kind of border guards and border controls do we need in the future? And that's particularly important given a few processes that we actually have happening in the EU. There is a review of the Frontex regulation. We have the discussions about the post-Stockholm program. And finally, studies on the European system of border guards. And that really begs under the question exactly what kind of border guards we need. But then in order to answer that question, as you rightly said, we really have to look at a set of challenges that are out there and how they actually relate to the nature of the job that all of you are doing. And I think there are 3 principal challenges or sets of issues which I think should be taken into consideration. One is that we basically have to discuss the future of border guards, not only in terms of what's going on within the Schengen and how Schengen evolves, but really look at it from the broader political perspective and international context. So a growing political volatility at Europe's neighborhood, but also among neighbors of the neighbors, right? So it's really spreading as far as to the Sahel area. We have the discussions about strategies in the Gulf of Guinea, and all those elements really play a crucial part in the discussion of what's the future of border guards. Now, how that all relates is really very simple. I mean, when we talk about all those situations outside of the EU, the response to those challenges is very often not only through foreign policy means, but very often through how we actually approach and deal with those challenges in the context of our internal security. And it's very difficult to address those challenges without really taking into account what's the role of border guards. I mean, the latest report produced by Frontex on risk analysis shows very clearly that with increasing migratory challenges from North Africa, we actually had evolution as well in migratory routes. I mean, we have very clear shift towards southern Mediterranean corridor, which wasn't the case in the past. Most of the irregular migrants comprehended on the borders actually come from Syria, which also points in the direction of the conflict and what the consequences are. Now, the second reason why the focus on the border guards is very important is due to the financial crisis, which is kind of internal but also external. I mean, the very direct consequence was, of course, the limited resources spent on very different policy areas. But at the same time, the challenges stemming from illicit activities outside of the EU borders and how they actually relate to the EU's own economic interest. The EU concept on CSDP support to integrated border management actually mentions many of those issues. Also discusses explicitly how the role of border guards relates to addressing those challenges. And if you look really at the content of most of the CSDP missions that the EU currently undertakes, their very nature very often relates to civilian missions and tasks performed by border guards. So the question, of course, is how do we fit that element into the puzzle? Then finally, the third point to take into account is, of course, that the border management increasingly becomes a multi-stakeholder process. It's not really the role for border guards anymore, but you have to think increasingly about getting others on board. That's the intelligence community, that's the law enforcement agencies, and there, of course, the challenge is how each of those relate to each other. Which brings me to the implications, and I think that there are three important sets that should be taken into account. One is really the challenges to cooperation itself. So we're very often constrained by legal systems and frameworks that impose certain obligations on us. And these are the obligations and kind of limitations that actually the criminals don't really have. And they can operate freely across several territories, reaching finally the EU borders. And that's part of the challenge. But then all this, let's say, complexity of challenges that I have talked about, be it within or outside of the EU, very often leads to blurring the division lines between specific functions, between law enforcement agencies, border guards, and so on. And I think that while those challenges need to be addressed in a very comprehensive way, we also have to be very clear about what agencies perform what specific functions in order not to result in the situation where we, for instance, start mixing the discussion about the NSA scandal and the use of the personal information for border management and law enforcement agencies. Now, that also has a very clear implication for mission and training of border guards. And if you really think about what I said and how the mission kind of and tasks have expanded, it almost seems that the role of border guards increasingly becomes a job of a superhero, because you have to be thinking about so many different issues that enter the picture that it's not anymore focusing really on border checks, but really thinking in a more comprehensive way, and very often going to the regions which otherwise would not be part of the mission. And I think that has to be reflected really in our thinking about the future of border guards. I mean, we're having a session on the Joint European Master Program for border guards in the afternoon, so that would be also an interesting element to pick up there. And finally, the third implication is really for security research. And I know that Frontex has a very dynamic unit working on the development and research. We have a Horizon 2020, which addresses societal challenges and security challenges in the future. But we shouldn't forget that very often those projects have very large societal implications. And I think Frontex and other agencies have been very much aware of that. The European Commission is very much involved into performing societal impact analysis for those different projects. But still, that's something that has to be very clearly said and kept in mind. In order not to be confronted with criticisms in the future. And I think I'll stop here and we can pick up some of those points in the discussion.
Patrick, thank you very much. Let me ask you one supplementary question, which relates to this enormous wisdom that Frontex has developed over the years when it comes to information, when it comes to risk analysis, how, in your view, this is taken up by the foreign and security policy community? I mean, you are a seasoned observer of Europe's common security and defense policy. So how is all that is coming from Frontex in terms of risk analysis and information about the challenges at our external frontiers, how is that integrated?
Well, it's definitely integrated in my work simply because I have time to go through the Frontex reports. I am afraid that people in Brussels or in capitals not always do that. But if you really look at the nature of the challenges for foreign policy, as I said, you cannot really find the solutions only through political means. You very often have to look at the implications they have for the EU's internal security, and you cannot really look at that, solve those problems without looking at what's the situation on the ground, how the patterns of migration change. I mean, we've heard the beginning a lot of focus on Frontex, on Schengen, but if you think, for instance, that two countries that are under tremendous pressure for illegal migration, which is Romania and Bulgaria, and actually not part of the system, and start analyzing how they actually fit and how that reflects on their policies, that's a very important consideration to be taken. Now, the EU foreign policy is increasingly taking into account this dependence. We have, as I said, the concept on the relationship between the border management and CSDP operations. There is more and more discussion about CSDP and Justice and Home Affairs in general, how the two are combined. And the concept paper produced by the External Action Service is actually quite an interesting read because it goes into very different components of preparation for specific missions, starting with staffing and ending really on issues related to operational management, civil-military relations on the ground. Now, you also have, I think, other than really strictly foreign policy-related agencies like the EAS, you really have, for instance, the EU counterterrorism coordinator who produces regularly papers. And one of the issues that increasingly gains resilience on the EU agenda is, of course, the issue of freedom fighters being trained in Syria and coming back to the European Union. And the role for the Frontex and border guards there is very explicitly mentioned. So, all this to say that it's very difficult to design an effective foreign policy response if you don't take into account how that response can relate to our internal security. I mean, the mantra of the EAS is comprehensive approach right now. You cannot really fully implement a comprehensive approach without using the tools that our border management systems provide.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Now, Anna, the legal framework is pivotal for EU border management. I would even venture into saying that the strength of EU border management is a function of how sturdy, how robust the legal framework is. So in your view, has the legal framework evolved sufficiently to meet the challenges which Patrick outlined for us?
Hello? Yeah? Okay, hello. Yeah. Also, myself, I have to thank for the invitation again and tackle on the question about the legal framework, referring to the lecture, actually, the introductory lecture. First of all, I would like to point out this is an amazingly interesting development politically, but also legally. And it's facing, looking at it from the bird perspective, a couple of challenges, which is, to break it down, to mainly two. Border guards or border controls, border surveillance, is execution of powers, usually executed by a state. So it's really, really interesting, also from a legal point of view, to have now a situation where you have a joint execution of powers by different member states, being coordinated by a supranational organization such as Frontex. And this clearly asks how can you legally actually find this. And looking at the regime, the integrated border regime, there's, I think, three aspects, which is one, solidarity, harmonization, and coordination. Coordination would be Frontex, and the harmonization is the legal harmonization of many different legal regimes which meet at the borders, at the different borders. One of the two difficult aspects is that because it's execution of power, it meets the questions of the rule of law and fundamental rights, which are usually provided by states to the individuals. And execution of border powers, they always go towards individuals. And these individuals, one need not to forget in the current frame, in the current world, not everywhere, but definitely in the European Union, these individuals are protected by fundamental rights. And that's why all execution of power needs to kind of go along the rule of law and also combine with these fundamental rights. And the second problem is the issue of territorial sovereignty. When member states, border guards, execute powers in different areas, in the territory of the different member states, there is the question of how public international law can solve this. Usually it's from the view of the public international law, or from the view of the perspective from the state. Of course, a state does not want a different state to execute powers within its territory unless it's accepted. So the legal framework has been combined by actually now different regulations, which you're probably all very familiar with. The main one would be the Schengen Border Codex, and which is kind of but also the Frontex regulation, the Rabbit regulation, which has been now supplemented by the new Frontex regulation from the year 2011. And now the very last bit coming up, which is being amended now, and it's going to be, I think, it's going to be done in June by the European Parliament and the Council, the new regulation on the surveillance of external sea borders. And this is the legal framework which kind of provides how border guards and how the protection of external borders goes along with the law. And the main idea behind this is, from the perspective first of the question of how can you solve this territoriality problem, is that the European Union provides a coordination framework and says that it works the way that member states who send their border guards to a hosting state of a coordinated operation, these border guards are implemented in the legal framework of this hosting state, which means that always the law of the hosting state applies and provides also the legal basis for all the execution of power, which creates very interesting, and it's in the German language, the Germans are also always very precise with the language, they call it Organleihe. I think in English it does not exist such an explicit word. Is pretty much the idea of lending an administrative body to a different administrative body, which kind of means that the legal framework for this body changes. And here a very interesting situation occurs that, for example, when the German border police goes to Spain and participates in a Frontex operation, it's not binded anymore by the German fundamental rights, but it's bound by the Spanish fundamental rights and also by the European fundamental rights, which is now the European Charter, for example, which creates a very interesting situation. However, the fundamental rights ceiling is always there. So that would be the one of the main outcomes. And I think looking at operations of Frontex within the territory of any member states, the legal situation is actually quite clear. The very big problem is the sea borders, the external sea borders. Why? Because there it's facing the issue of extraterritoriality, which creates it's such big problems. What law does apply when a state in general, and also this creation, goes extraterritorial? And this is tried now to be solved by the new regulation, which also has different issues, which maybe we can tackle on later. The problem of the extraterritorial protection of the sea borders is that there you also meet different regimes, which is, for example, the UNCLOS, the Sea Convention, but also the requirements by the SAR, which is the Search and Rescue Convention, and also the Safety of Life Convention. And also, this is another step, also, of course, the well-known problem of the non-refoulement and the Refugee Convention, but also combined in the Article 3 of the European Charter, European Convention of Human Rights. And all these regimes kind of find themselves there, and it's really, at the moment, difficult to, or there is different approaches on what is actually legal. As you might know, there's a huge discussion also among scientists, if, for example, the new regulation and also if the Frontex operations are actually allowed to provide those pushbacks operations of boats. This is definitely a legal issue which is not solved. The legal framework would rather say, would be my perspective, it's not allowed if you go extraterritorial. And this problem is also not going to be solved by the new regulation. But this is definitely something we can discuss. Just to sum it up, maybe, I think, as I said, the legal framework is there. The European Union provides the rule of law, it provides the fundamental rights, and so do the member states. The problem lies a little bit in the practice, as we all know, and also in the main problem is the extraterritoriality if you put the operations outside of the territory. There you have the huge legal problems which are not solved till today.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I understand you would also expect future development to be most intensive when it comes to the protection of the sea border, given this number of unresolved issues facing us.
I think, yeah, of course. The problem is, though, that effectiveness meets here the question of the rule of law. And now the question is, do you want more effectiveness? And if effectiveness always faces the ceiling of the rule of law, and it always faces the ceiling of fundamental rights, which is very important. And this should not be contradictory, but in some way it is. But of course, I think everyone is aware that being bound by those, let's say, fundamental rights, you need to find a very good balance for the new regulations, which...
But to deconstruct what you are saying, because you are saying we're facing a ceiling, but in practical terms, can this be resolved on the legal grounds, or is it more a question of the practice?
It's for the extraterritorial operations. There needs to be a legal framework. This still needs to be resolved. We can still see if the new regulation is going to be helpful for that. But there is some issues if this is actually legal, what has been written down there. And also, but I think the main problem is the law cannot solve those practical problems. It cannot solve the issue that there will be huge, or that there are migrants flows that people actually will always like to, or will always feel forced, for whatever reasons, to get those boats and join the journey. And law cannot really solve these problems. It can only provide the frame.
Anna, thank you very much. This was loud and clear. Now let's go inside the member states and look at some of the phenomena which arouse people's concerns and fears. Mark, you are a criminologist. So how do these phenomena relate to border management?
Okay, thank you for the question. And being a criminologist, first to explain, we are not lawyers, we are not sociologists, we are based in legal scholarship, but also, of course, in sociology, in economy, in politics, and so on. So criminologists are often kings without a country, and kings without a country means we are dealing with a specific topic, and I will come to it, of course. We are dealing with crime, and the advantage of being a criminologist is that there will always be crime, so that there will always be job for criminologists. But we are not just dealing with crime as such, but also with authors, perpetrators, as well as victims, and looking into the causes of crime, and especially the reaction to crime. And for that I will come to the statement of Ruben when he said Schengen was a real, or will be a real, laboratory for what is happening. It was the same for criminologists, because due to Schengen, things moving in Europe, more and more we became interested in international topics on crime. So what do we see and within the European Union, and dealt with individual citizens? What we saw is when the Schengen area came over there, that a lot of local citizens suddenly became interested in crime. Crime as a problem, because in the past crime needed to be solved by policing and justice. Today, and during the evolution, we saw that citizens saw crime, and especially security, as a topic, and security also as a political topic. Security in itself will influence elections. We saw it in the individual member states, from the far right to the far left, but also the parties in the center who were dealing with security. So what did we saw, and what are possible evolutions? And I think one of the major books and new books everyone should read, especially dealing with these topics, is Robert Kaplan's The Revenge of Geography. A lot of things are happening towards geography, not only in Europe, but in the entire world, which has a huge, or will have a huge impact on individual citizens' behavior. So there is a concern for security. How can we deal with that concern for security? And that's also part of the science when we are studying reaction towards crime, reaction towards feelings of insecurity, not only crime and insecurity, but also incivilities. Everyone got concerned about security. That from a criminological perspective, one developed two new concepts, and I think these concepts need to be taken into reflections, and I'm glad, and if you see the activity reports, if you see the publications coming from Frontex, but also from other border protection organizations, there is a lot of scientific basis in it. It's not just an idea, it's really research. But new concepts, in my opinion, and working at Brussels University, and most of European citizens know Brussels, but in fact I'm living only 40 kilometers up to the north of Brussels in the city of Antwerp. And the city of Antwerp is not only known for its diamonds, of course, but especially for its huge port. It's a major harbor. What do we see? With the colleagues from the Netherlands, that the port of Rotterdam and the port of Antwerp, there's only 100 kilometers between them, is becoming one major port. So what was introduced from criminological science is the concept of nodal security. And in the word of nodal, you hear the word a knot. It becomes a knot. Antwerp and Rotterdam will be one region. We have the same, and it's also referred in publications of Frontex. What happens between France and Belgium, France and Germany? International crime is looking for those knots. So we need to think on the concept of nodal security, which is a different approach than just an individual member state approach, and even as an EU approach, because these become regions in which crime will be part of the game. The second one, and it refers to the concept of integrated border management, and perhaps we can come to it in a second round or due to some questions. What does it mean, integrated? Integrated, in my opinion, means, as Patrick said, it's multi-layer, multi-agency. You have a lot of agencies responsible for one topic. This is quite new. And it means that you have to coordinate them. You need to manage that kind of approach. And that integrative approach is, in my opinion, and not only in my opinion, but in scientific opinion, only possible when you work on phenomena, not crime. That's too large. But you can if you work on trafficking human beings, if you work on airport fraud and so on. If you come into organ trading, you need to go to the phenomenon and work towards the phenomenon on an integrated way. Integrated way also means prevention, not only controlling and repression, but also a kind of aftercare. So that notion of integrated security, I think, will be one of the future challenges. And I think I can stop this first introduction here.
Mark, thank you very much. If I could just pick up what you said at the end, relating very clearly to how the integrated concept has to be put to work. I mean, what are the missing pieces of the puzzle in your view in that framework today? I think you were absolutely right in the fact that we need to focus on the specific phenomena rather than speak of crime as such. But do you see any particular gaps in that system today?
When you speak on integrated security, and it was a concept out of the 90s, not only invented but researched in the Netherlands, that it also include other agencies. And one of the two missing links, if I can call them, and you're asking for them, is of course one, because these are the topics I'm also dealing with at the university, is the private security and the private security industry as such. And on the other hand, the intelligence community. First, the private security industry, and I really state the word industry because it became an industry. In Europe, for example, there is a cooperation between the labor unions, but also with the employers' side. They already published 4 white papers on the role of private security in Europe. What can we conclude of that industry? It's a supply-driven economy from an economic perspective. What does it mean? They supply new services. And for example, they are thinking, they are researching, they are looking, of course, to border management. That's one of the issues which will come, in my opinion, for the future, due to budget restrictions. Whether they are better or not better, more efficient or not, that's not a discussion. It will all be dealt with the money there is. And another topic is the big distinction between intelligence and surveillance. If I look to border management, in my opinion, and from a theoretical perspective, it's more surveillance. It's on the spot, online, what is happening. We need to take decisions right now based on the information we have. If you're dealing with intelligence, it's more on the long term. What are new trends? What is the information we gather? How can we analyze them? And then you come into the concept of criminal analysis as such. So, and in order to conclude, 2 missing links can be the private security industry and the intelligence community.
Mark, thank you very much. Now, Ilkka, your vast experience in a nutshell. I want to ask you the initial question about the border management strategy, how it has fared over the years. Do you think it has stood the test of time? And also this enormous question of public scrutiny. I mean, it is EP election time today, and people are growing more and more sensitive to the issues of internal security. Now, Ruben told us that Schengen should remain a laboratory of practice, and I know exactly what he means. But at the same time, if you tell the people that you are creating a laboratory, aren't you going to have some angst and anxieties in place?
Thank you very much, Pavel. Good morning, all of you. I'm repeating what I think I have said during the previous European days for border guards days, that the beginning of this event is very stimulating and interesting, and this is what I'm repeating also today. It was a very interesting lecture that we learned about Schengen, and now the core issue in this panel is about integrated border management. And I think the timing is very good to discuss these issues, provided that the post-Stockholm program is under the finalization at the political level, and then we do have the processes going in parallel to see whether there are needs to modify Frontex regulation, the recent update of the maritime rules, and also the outcome of the study of the European border guard system. So many things are on the table at the same time. And I think it's very relevant to take a look, what do we have right now, and then make the comparison on the needs and the existing situation, which is called the gap. So it was indeed in 2006 when the integrated border management strategy of the European Union was endorsed by the Council, containing these 5 elements. And I know that you all know them by heart. And that's why I'm just making an answer, asking myself whether these elements are still valid. And I think there is something that we should do to take a look piece by piece, the border checks, the fighting crime, the interagency cooperation which was mentioned, the geographical approach, and then the political and the legal frame. I think all of them needs the revision, and we have to approach these by just looking from outside to see whether it's there. I do have my opinion, and I'm going to say something about that. But before going into these points, I think we have to focus on and clear our minds about the risks. If you take a look at the recently published book of best practices by Frontex, in fact it was published last week. It's called 12 Seconds to Decide, and that's of course the work of the border guard carrying out border checks at the borders. It's mentioned and also illustrated that, for instance, in 2012 we have in Europe 70,000 detected illegal border crossings. At the same time we had 700 million legal border crossings. So the relevant question is, do we really think that the core risk is within this 70,000, or could we imagine that there are some undetected risks within this 700 million? If we follow the political debate and what is in public now, it's all about the Mediterranean Sea, it's all about the eastern land border, the eastern Mediterranean route, it's all about this kind of things. But have we really focused on enough on this 700 million case? I have to say that we haven't. The other problem that we had and we have is that within this 70,000 we are squeezing all things together, and it's just like one flow of people who are crossing the border against the rules. But if we scratch the surface a little bit and take a look what kind of people they are, we see quite a vast variety of people in different situations, which of course requires different type of cure and measures to be taken. There can be terrorists, there can be criminals, but there are people who are seeking for better life, and there are people who are fleeing from in order to seek for international protection. Let's not squeeze and put all these people together and trying to find one size fits all solution. And this brings me back to the question whether the integrated border management structure is valid. I think the structure is valid, but what can we do more by using external relations? It was mentioned already. What can we do more when it comes to maritime policies? What can we do more with the private side, societies, which was mentioned by Mark, and intelligence community? This was one key point of the discussion, what was mentioned about so-called foreign fighters, that we are living separate lives, the intelligence community and law enforcement, including border control. The other problem, which in a way comes out from the situational picture, is the problem of the called simplification. Too often, and I have to point my finger to the politicians and also to public, we are simplifying these phenomena, both what is happening and also what should be the response. Too often we just say, okay, we have a problem in Mediterranean, more boats, more surveillance, or we have a problem at the land border between Greece and Turkey or Bulgaria and Turkey are more border guards. It's part of the structure, but definitely it will not solve the problem. We can upgrade the likelihood and the probability to detect the illegal border crossing from 83 to 95%. But the problem persists because the processing of these cases cannot be solved by increasing patrolling capacity. I think from the legal point of view, what Anna said, I do agree. There are some concerns as regards the extraterritorial, but I think the situation is becoming more and more clearer, not only because of the regulations, but also the verdicts from different courts. We know more and more what can be done and what cannot be done. Non-refoulement, it's clear. How it is written, it's very, very clear. But I was a little bit surprised that we have not mentioned and we don't tackle the core legal dilemma that we have. And it's very simple. It comes from the Schengen Borders Code, Article 2, Article 12, which says that the purpose of border surveillance is to prevent illegal border crossings, period. That's the purpose. It's not a violation of the law. It's the explicit stipulation of European law. But on the other hand, we have some other binding regulations, laws, principles, which are dealing with access to international protection, non-refoulement and things like that. And we have not discussed this point. How to mitigate or make the resilience between these two things which are binding. And those guys who have to make the decision at the ports of entry in 12 seconds and who are patrolling, they are in the middle of this problem. It's very simple thing. It's not some sort of the high-level discussions. So once again, what are the legitimate ways to meet the requirement for prevention in the current legal and political environment? This is the key question. And I was very pleased Patrick, what you said about what kind of border guards do we need. It's one essential part of the future of the integrated border management structure. But I think we should not only take a look what is happening outside, because after all, we are civil servants. We are serving the societies, which means that we have to follow very carefully how the societies are developing, what it would be 20 years from here, what kind of border guards the societies are in need in 20 years. Not just look how the geopolitical situation will develop, but what kind of servants the societies need in the future. So summing up, I think the role of border control as a whole has to be clarified. We have to be patient and in a way we have to teach what we are doing and what is this all about, serving different purposes, as it was mentioned. Not only dealing with crime, not only dealing with migration, not only dealing with the facilitation of the legitimate and bona fide border crossings, these 700 million, but also feeding the information which is needed at the time of austerity of the societies to be more targeted in whatever we do in order to meet the expectations from the society. And the simplification, once again, I have to keep on repeating that let's get rid of the simplification of these things. These are complex issues which requires a comprehensive a response, and I think that the integrated border management structure of the European Union, once amended and updated, is a relevant instrument to meet these challenges. So this, I think, is enough at the time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilkka. I would like to open up for comments and questions very shortly, but perhaps before I do that, this was just a warning for you to signal to me your intention to speak. And there will be microphones traveling very, very briefly. But perhaps before I do that, I would like to ask the other three speakers if they have any solutions to this list of challenges that Ilkka has outlined, because what he suggested is a certain logic of thinking about these issues with focus on the nature of risk. Patrick, I can see that you have something on top of your head already.
Yes, I actually like very much the comment you made about the politics in the first place, that very often the whole discussion is hijacked by the politics, and I think that this is a very good assessment of the situation. For instance, the discussion we have about the function creep in the case of entry-exit system, it wasn't really it hasn't really originated on the side of those who have invented the mechanisms, but really came from the political side that actually wanted to start using the data for different purposes. But I actually liked even better your question about what kind of civil servants will we need when we talk about border guards in the future. And I have been giving some thinking to it myself, and there's a lot of discussion about the future of smart borders. And I actually thought that maybe what we need is to start talking about smart border guards. And smart is not an adjective, it's an abbreviation of 5 adjectives. And let me explain what I thought that actually those 5 adjectives could be. So S would stand for sensible, and sensible in the pragmatic approach to the challenges they're dealing with. Very often it's we assume that technology is answer to everything. What I think we need is border guards that are sensible in judging the situation and actually being able to make this final call, which you said, within the 12 seconds. M is for motivated. And I think the challenge there is really to make the mission and functions of border guards being defined very clearly. We have mentioned it yourself. Now, A stands for accountable, and that's exactly this kind of civil aspect of the discussion that you mentioned, how the societies actually will hold us accountable. Pavel, you mentioned that one. R stands for responsible, and that goes back to what Anna said about being really aware of this human rights aspect and civil liberties aspects, right? We have to keep in mind that very often the information you have at hand is not really an item, it's someone's life. And I think that having in mind this huge responsibilities that comes with the access to information we have is an important thing. And finally, T stands for trained. And I think that's one big challenge for the future. You mentioned the issue of foreign fighters as well, and it's surprising that if you think about all these new tools that we have developed over the past years, at the end of the day, you really rely on very basic skill, which was the border guards' profiling skills, given the person they have in front of them. So all those 5, sensible, motivated, accountable, responsible, and trained, stand, in my view, for a smart border guard. And this is what I would like to see in 20 years, to answer your question.
Thank you very much. I'm very much interested how the participants would also respond to your call in a while. Anna, would you like to respond?
Well, yeah, the problem is, I think that, so thank you for both statements, that I think being a laboratory is the problem that also the border guards, there's 2 sides of it, the border guards and also the people who are meeting the surveillance of borders, they've been thrown into this laboratory. And as we said, it's not about the size of the bananas, it's about actually pretty much regulations about how people, it's about their lives. But it's also about the border guards who actually have to face and to know what can I do. And I think it has been a very irresponsible approach from the political side that something has been put upon and said, go out there and protect the borders. And after that, that's my impression, after that it started thinking about how can we do this legally, or we need a legal framework, we need to kind of create something more. And it is kind of a step that should have been done before and not after. But now, as you said, there's more and more clarification coming, which is good. And I think this smart border guard, let's put this as a a straightforward slogan. It sounds indeed interesting and good. Some problems will not be solved because they are, I think, political, and they are also problems of societies. What do the societies want? Do they want to have open societies? Do we want to have closed society? Do we need migration? Do we want these people to be here? What kind of people do we need? Do we need only qualified people? Do we don't need not qualified people? Do we want to keep them out? But this is not a legal problem. The legal frame is there, maybe with some little issues that still need to be clarified. But what we need is actually more solutions from societies and from politics at the moment, I think, mainly.
Thank you very much, Anna. And Mark, your last word before we go to the audience.
Very, very short and very brief. I think the notion of smart borders, my point of view is all people working in border management, they are smart. So we are not dealing with the people in itself, but in my concept, smart refers to the huge influence technology and especially new technologies will have. And you see the same discussion today in another area, which is dealt within NATO. What do we do with autonomous weapons? That's not only a technical discussion, but also an ethical discussion. And I think ethics need to be involved in thinking the unthinkable, because that's the purpose of looking towards the future. And for that, I always tell my students in this kind of discussions, it's always the balance, and it's said by Rubin, it's said by everyone, but that balance was introduced by Benjamin Franklin. If you're willing to get rid of your freedom for security, you don't deserve one of them. So it's always the balance we have to look, and especially into technology, and posing not only technological, but also ethical, political questions before introducing it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So now it's over to you, and I saw already one hand going up here, and then second one there, third one, very good. And I will ask Ruben Zayotti to comment first, just to warn you as well. So please ask him questions also, please. If you could please introduce yourselves when you speak. Yeah, the gentleman right here, maybe. When we start, you were the first, so.
My name is Klaus Rösler, and I'm Frontex Director of Operations Division. And I would like to have two questions from the operational point of view, from the practitioner's point of view. And we have learned in this panel a lot of, and we have been briefed about the legal framework, the institutional framework. Our basic knowledge has been refreshed, what is good, and we have learned also of the external dimension of the JHA business. But I would like to ask the panel, how far can we go and how far should go the European system of border guard development, considering all this framework and considering these limitations, and how to find a balanced way between the desired European development and the consideration of national sovereignty, national execution of the law. And the second question, what tells us the criminologic analysis of the border situation, the 700 millions compared to the 70,000 detected illegal crossing? What tells us this situation for the future development, for the future needs of border management? And this I would like to ask the panel to be a little bit more concrete, to help the practitioners, to support for political decision making, to pave or to describe a bit the way forward.
Very good. Thank you very much. So you're asking for solutions. Gentleman here, if you could, yes, also introduce yourself, please. Yeah.
My name is Trpe Stojanovski, and I'm representing MARI initiative which exist on the Western Balkans, and 6 countries are members of the initiative. Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. And one of the member states from Mari already is EU member states. The other countries are oriented on that way. I would like to make short comment, and I have one question after that. I appreciate very much the products developed by Frontex. Before that, we faced a lot of difficulties when we spoke, for example, about the asylum seekers from the Western Balkans to the EU countries, and the response from the relevant people from EU countries was in one-way direction, sometimes with enough reasons to complain on that, but not always, because it's an issue, phenomenon which needs a response from the countries of origin. And before Frontex developed the Western Balkan migration risk assessment, it was so difficult to respond on some aspects. With this document, for the first time, we have clear picture what's going on. We have elements from the countries of origin and from countries of destination, which is extremely important tool for the countries which are out of European Union. And now with much more arguments, we can speak about that phenomenon and to locate the challenges from where, for example, this phenomenon is coming. With Frontex, we got a backbone about the security policy regarding the border issue. And now it's much easier for us outside of the Frontex area to contribute in that concept. And thanks to Frontex, we have a lot of successful projects. That is one excellent example how Frontex can contribute not just for the EU countries, but also for the other regions in Europe. And before Frontex, probably there was no such concern, because the risks were not identified at all. With Frontex, we appreciate very much that we have much clearer platform how we can cooperate. And my question is, excellent presentations. I would like to suggest probably after this event, all discussions to be publicized, because a lot of important messages are, and it could be important bibliography for everyone. My question is going to Professor Mark. He mentioned the issue of ethics. In such unbalanced situation, when the political decisions are coming like pillars, like frames, in which quantity the ethics is present in making the sustainable aspects, sustainable platform for further action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you got the $1 million question there. I saw one hand there. Yes, you have the microphone.
Hello, my name is Kotor. I'm from the Anti-Fraud Office, European Office in Olaf. And thank you very much for... Okay, my name is Kotor. I'm from the Olaf. And thank you, the panelists, for a very interesting presentation. And actually, I have a question about how do you see the future of cooperation between the border guards and the customs? This is a brotherhood service which is also operating at the borders. So it wasn't mentioned a few already by you that the intelligence services, the enforcement services, and but the customs hasn't been mentioned. And I would like to ask you, how do you see the future, how the customs will be incorporated into the integrated border management, and how the customs services, I know that they are cooperating now at the moment, can be or should further develop within this concept. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And any last comments or questions, maybe to get the balance right from the other sides of the room? No? It's a free world, so you don't have to, and we also have very little time. In this case, Ruben Zayotti, can I ask you to respond, maybe just to have some division of labor, to the first question, which was the most fundamental, about the final destination of border management system?
Okay, so the question was about whether we can see a future in which there's going to be a truly European type of border management or truly European border guards. I mean, I'm looking for the sort of broad perspective. Of course, you have, as practitioners, you have a better sense what it means on the ground. And of course, there are some legal implications and practical implications of having this regional approach. From a political perspective, I would say that I don't see any possibility in the short term to having a truly European border guard. And if I see, in terms of the projection, the evolution of border controls, I see that that might happen down the road, but the way it might happen has to be through a similar type of approach that the Schengen regime has used in the past, which is the one that I mentioned before, is the pragmatic approach. There might be a de facto European border guard systems, or de facto European border guards, but without necessarily the term attached to it, so without the formalities attached to this new approach to border management. So in a sense, there is some hope that that might happen, but certainly there isn't the political will, and I would say even the popular will coming from below to have such a system. Before you get to the point, there has to be a broader discussion about what it means to have European borders. Are we really ready as citizens, European citizens, to imagine the existence of borders that are not national, but European, so in a sense supranational? And I think we're not there yet. The people working in the border management might provide the sort of the first step towards this direction. But again, doesn't mean that necessarily that the political and the popular support is going to be behind, at least not in the short term.
Thank you very much, Ruben. Well, Marek, there was one question earmarked for you. Why don't we start with ethics?
When dealing with ethics, how the discussion ethics and security, when was it invented as such? It came from the concept of one of the famous legal scholars already in the 17th, 18th century, Hugo de Grotius. It was the concept of the just war. When is a war just? When can we justify a war? These are the same questions with justifying security actions. And the discussion, even today, and in ethics there is no solution. I think the most important thing is that we consider ethics, and there you have always two positions. This is the old Kantian perspective. Do not to someone what you don't like to be done to you. This is a very good issue. Think if you were in the case, and the other hand, of course, and that's the discussion, especially in the United States, towards consequentialism. What are the consequences? What are the results of it when we do something or if we don't do something? And that's go to utilitarianism, and that's also a position. And as always, I think good positions are in the middle of them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Patrick and Anna, there was the question about how we read the message coming from the 70,000 illegal crossings and the 700 million legal crossings, and how do we make sure that we have an answer which takes good care of these phenomena. Anna, would you like to start?
Okay, I would like to start. First, though, I would like to include the question that was said, what is the future? And also just kind of ask the question if, for example, a European border guard, like an actual border guard organization, one organization is possible. If it's politically wanted, it's a different question, but if the question is if it's legally possible. And for example, from the German perspective, I think it could face difficulties according to the national perspective. What kind of sovereign powers can we still and more transfer to the European Union? The situation is all different in the member states, but for example, taking into account the Lisbon Treaty decision of the German Supreme Court, it could be very difficult from the perspective of the German basic law to actually transform this power totally to the European Union. because, for example, the German Supreme Court considers military and also police forces as the core of sovereignty, which cannot be transferred to the European Union. So that will be just a side idea of the future of such a one European institution for border control. Second, coming back to this question with this legal, illegal, the numbers. I think the problem is we can actually maybe for 1 second lean back and ask ourselves indeed, why do we have border controls? Why do we need them? And the answer is usually, it's very philosophical answer as well, but it's also pragmatical. Well, because we're afraid of illegal migration, but the question is, why are we afraid of it? Because as you said, obviously, most of the entrances are actually legal, and crime is also homemade. So it's not that if we, for example, have this huge threat of illegal entrances that, and we can prevent that there will be no crime. I mean, crime is also homemade, and there will always be criminal. I mean, with illegal or no illegal immigration, there will always be crime. And also the question why. I mean, this is not something that border guards have to answer, but just lean back and look at this from an objective perspective. Why do we actually need such strict borders? I'm not saying that they're not needed, but I'm just saying that maybe from time to time we still have to lean back and ask ourselves the question if it's not also an ethnical problem, if it's not a problem of creating closed societies, of kind of having we are different than the others, and what would happen if we open our borders. This is something you don't have to answer, but maybe think about it. And this kind of tackles the issue of the whole situation that was created after the September 11th, the war on terror, for example. We have a huge, so from the legal perspective, we have huge cutting inside. It's nothing to do with border controls, but also with just security issues. We have a huge cutting of the freedom rights, especially in the area of, for example, data protection. And the question is, does this actually help or does it not help? This is something experts need to answer. And for example, the answer at the moment is that many human rights activists would say, well, no, because we're cutting down fundamental rights, but we're not actually gaining too much out of it. And the question is, what do we want? Do we want still our freedom of the fundamental rights, or do we want this security effectiveness? And this is a discussion that have been launched, and I think the answer is really, really difficult, and everyone has to kind of have maybe his own opinion about that. And this comes down then to border controls. It's exactly the same question.
Thank you very much, Anna. And Patrick, I will want to ask you an impossible question. This final destination of border management in Europe, do you think it's going to be shaped more by internal developments, how the risks are perceived inside Europe, or is it going to be shaped more from the outside by what goes on in the international context?
It is a question impossible, especially since the company page to answer this question is still working on it, but let me try to tackle it. I think it really goes back to the initial question we had, which is what's the mission and the future mission of border guards? Is it really the protection of the interiors of the European Union, or are we really looking into a more comprehensive function? And if I have to look only at the internal function, I don't think we're going to get far, exactly because of all those sovereignty questions that were raised. Where I see the chance for establishing maybe a bigger role for border management and the border guards is really by exploring this external dimension. So as I said, a lot of the CSDP missions right now are really having a huge border management component. Now, if the border guards will not be willing to uptake the challenge and incorporate it into their mission, the question is, of course, who will do it? And the risk there is that, of course, the tasks will be taken over by the military. So if you want to have a certain role, you could really imagine that, let's say, one of the functions for the European border guards being really the external representation, right? If we really have to intervene and if we want to have a civilian mission abroad, why not to have a team comprising border guards from several member states and have this kind of a permanent pole? That could be, for me, one of the options which I think could be acceptable for most of member states. There are no sovereignty issues involved. Of course, the question is, do we really have the capacities to commit? In what numbers do we want to commit? And so on and so forth. But I'd like to go back very quickly to this question about, how do we actually split those big numbers from smaller ones? Where do we look for the danger? And I think it might be a bit too simplistic to work along the lines of regular and non-regular migrants and those who come legally, illegally. I think that in both groups you will find those who shouldn't be there. So when we talk about illegal migrants, let's not forget that very often we also have asylum seekers who have legitimate reasons to flee their country, and we cannot really throw them in the same bag with people who might be coming for whatever other reasons, criminals and so on. On the other hand, I also understand, and as citizens I feel very uncomfortable with the idea that we're developing all new tools that actually throw me in the same bag as any potential terrorist or criminal and so on. Now, what is the answer to that? And this is the answer I give to myself. And ethics is only part of it, I think. But we have to look at it, but I think, as you rightly pointed out, focusing only on ethics is not really sustainable. I see it rather as a three-step process. So ethics is really the first step, where you really try to analyze whether the solution you're putting on the table is ethical in terms of technology you're developing and then in the implementation phase. But we also have to think about the next step, which is what if things go wrong? What if this function creep really materializes and we have abuses? And there I like to think that simultaneously in developing all those tools and policies, we really have to strengthen the rule of law and accountability, and that's the second step. Now, if that fails, the only ultimate measure you have is really the political responsibility of those that govern. And for us then, the only way to change that is the elections. We're on the eve of the European elections. How many and how often has the issue of privacy and data protection been debated across Europe? Very rarely. But this is an argument that's very often raised when we talk about security and new measures, right? So that really tells you that at the end of the day, it's not something that preoccupies European citizens. It's more something that's momentary. But we as policymakers, whether it's there or not, have to really keep all those three stages in mind, in my view.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And before we finish, Ilka, I want us to remember about the customs service question, if you could refer to it. But above that, if you invited all of us for the conversation with your successor, whoever he or she might be, and if you wanted us to hear the main message that you would put forward to he or she, what would that message be?
Thank you very much. I think I have now 4 questions to answer. I would like to start with the question on the cooperation with customs, and that was more than a relevant question. And it's within the integrated border management structure belonging to the element called interagency cooperation. If we are objective and we are fair, I think we cannot afford working separately. It's because of the increase of passenger and flows and the flows of goods. It's because of that we need more and more information and intelligence. And it's because of the financial and human resource reality. Now the question is, how are we organizing it, and how far can we develop the cooperation, which is essential? So this is my message of that. I think we just witnessed the classic example of being in a panel discussion where at the end of the panel someone pops up the core question that we can debate days and weeks, and that is, why do we have border control? I tried to have a good and a short answer for this question. I think we need border control because people belonging to society have created certain rules, and those rules should be enforced. That is why we need border control. I do not agree that we need border control because we are afraid of illegal immigration. It's part of that. We are concerned about the rules, we are concerned about crime, we are concerned about how permeable the borders are to legitimate cross borders. Then the question, this eternal question about the European border guard. Now we are in the European days for border guards, and too often we jump to this discussion without answering the simple question: where is the need? Why should we have something which has been discussed since middle 90s? Why? Tell me why, and then I think it's a good time to start discussing about what can be taken. And the same applies to these studies on systems and so on. In fact, we do have a system. We do have the strategy that we were now discussing. I don't think that we have to make the revolution on this system. We should make a further evolution of this system. I know that member states will not give up all aspects which belong to their borders, and Anna mentioned it very, very clearly, just using one thing. But let's continue developing what we already have. We have some political ideas. They can be perhaps reviewed, and now they are going to do it when the post-Stockholm program is under finalization. We have European law, which is directly binding to the member states. We have some secondary law, some soft law as well. And we do have a common understanding on the purpose. And we do have a cooperation structure where Frontex plays the role of coordinator. So in fact, we do have a lot of elements. So why should we start discussing something that we cannot convince ourselves that we have a need of? But let's focus on taking the elements that we have and develop them further. And I'm the believer of this evolution and development. Then the final lure that you just throw to me, what is my message? My message to my successor is that let the machinery work. Think about things and think what is feasible and what is not. Thank you.
Ilkka, thank you very much for making clear how you would report on these 9 years of incredible achievements. I mean, you built Frontex from scratch into a powerful agency that caters for what it needs to cater for in Europe's border management, given the legal situation and given the political will of the moment. Many thanks to all our panelists. I think we have several messages going out of our discussion. The first one to me is that the risks are differentiated and they will probably become even more differentiated. And what this means is emphasis on the I words, integrated. I think in the next 5 years in the European Union, this will, for all intents and purposes, be probably the most important concept, how we integrate the different functions, how we ensure that the different services work together. Before I ask you to thank our panelists, let me make 2 housekeeping announcements. We are a little bit late, but in 20 minutes after the coffee break, for which I would now like to invite you, we would start the European Masters ceremony, and this will take place in the Skybox room. Here in this room at 12:30, there will be another debate, Migrants at Sea, High Expectations, Limited Solutions, that will take forward some of the issues that we mentioned during this panel. But without further ado, please join me in thanking warmly our panelists for an incredibly interesting discussion.